Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the executive editor of conservativehome.com, and I'm joined, of course, by the star of the show, Jacob Rees-Mogg, MP. How are you, Jacob?
I'm very well, thank you. Very pleased to have got to episode 5. Soon we'll be competing with the Archers.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there's a high bar to aim for. Maybe we'll start the shipping forecast and graduate to the Archers omnibus, perhaps. We're recording this on the Monday, the 12th, but it will, of course, go out on the same day as the Spring Statement, Tuesday. What's your anticipation for the Chancellor's offering at this new spring moment?
Well, the Chancellor's been very clear that this is a legal obligation because the ABR has to provide forecasts twice a year, and that he wants to get away from the history of two large financial announcements and just have the major budget announcement in the autumn, and this to be a formality. So I wouldn't expect great fireworks on Tuesday afternoon.
Do you think the media and indeed the Westminster kind of village or circus, depending how you view it, will allow him to get away with that? I mean, George Osborne, of course, intensified Gordon Brown's tradition of using these things as almost fiscal press releases, an opportunity to kind of bump up oneself as Chancellor as much as talk about the economy, and they've created some demand. Do you think the Chancellor can withdraw the supply from that demand?
It's a very interesting question. One of Philip Hammond's greatest strengths is that he is a very serious-minded, economically based Chancellor rather than a politically based Chancellor. And although I have a number of disagreements with his approach to Brexit, I think as a Chancellor he's doing the right thing to be focused on the economics, not purely on the next press release. There are great difficulties, as both George Osborne and Gordon Brown found, of making your economic policy fit the news cycle. It doesn't always mean that you do the right thing economically.
And we've obviously recently seen the news that at long last, admittedly a couple of years overdue on George Osborne's original plan, but at long last we're into surplus on day-to-day spending at least.
Well, I'd be a bit careful about that. I'm very suspicious of saying day-to-day spending and excluding bits that are inconvenient. The figures have improved very significantly. This traditionally happens that when the deficit begins to shrink, it shrinks faster than anticipated, but likewise, when it rises, it also rises faster than anticipated. I don't think you can exclude debt interest and, quote, investment, because government investment is very unlike private sector investment. It doesn't seek to get a financial return, except in a very small number of circumstances, such as toll bridges. It's merely the packaging of government expenditure. So I think ultimately we need to get to a genuine surplus or break even. And when the economy is going well, this is one of the automatic stabilisers that governments should be enthusiastic about.
So would you say you're a little concerned about some of the response there's been to this news on, let's say, quote, day-to-day surplus, in that there have been some voices in Tory circles saying, at last, this is over, we can start dishing out things, turn on the taps?
Well, Conservatives shouldn't be in favour of large spending splurges by the government, because Conservatives fundamentally believe that taxpayers spend their own money better than the government can spend it for them. And that seems to underpin what Philip Hammond is saying, that his response to this has been extremely sensible and cautious. Having said all that, the length of time that we've had austerity has meant that there are some particular strains which need to be tackled, that the NHS is the most obvious one. And the figures here are quite stark, that since 2010 the average increase in NHS spending in real terms has been 1.1%. From 1979 to 1997 it was 3.4%, so a long period of Conservative government was running at 3 times the real terms annual increase in NHS expenditure. Considering the ageing and indeed growing population that we have had and continue to have, and the advances in medical technology, I'd be very surprised if keeping austerity in the NHS at this level is going to be sustainable. But then you've got to work out where the money comes from. Some of it comes from slightly faster growth in receipts that allows the government some flexibility. I expect some of it to come from the Brexit dividend. I think that is an important source of funding, and it's why we want to ensure we don't give the European Union too much, and that we start making payments for imaginary benefits as soon as possible.
So that would be a portion of the famous £350 million a week, potentially?
That's right, and I think it's also important in political terms because, in my view, voters do not look at the small print of election promises. They look at what the promise appears to say. And the bus said £350 million could be spent on the NHS. Now, there are lots of ways of getting out of this. One is to say that it was a conditional, it could be spent, it wasn't a promise. The other is to say, well, the Vote Leave campaign wasn't trying to form a government, it was merely putting an argument. But I don't think voters think like that. I think they say, there was £350 million on the side of the bus, we want £350 million a week for the NHS. And therefore the government has to try and find that sort of level of funding, and you get about half of it from the net saving in our contributions to the EU, and the rest of it needs to be found from other sources.
Is there a case to say that over the last 10, 11 years, the Conservative Party has almost failed to properly assess the public's view on fiscal questions? You know, when after the financial crisis struck, the Conservative Party was still committed, I think, for a whole year to matching Labour's spending plans at the next election. And then, arguably, in 2010, it wasn't as radical as the electorate were willing to be on spending. Now, the party is starting, perhaps belatedly, to realise that maybe last year's general election was affected much more by frustrations among voters with perceived austerity than on questions of Brexit, for example.
Well, it's very easy to make the correct political decision with hindsight, but it was always a mistake to drop conservative economic principles. It happened for very good reasons. We'd lost 3 general elections in a row, 97, 01 and 05, and the modernisers thought that they should copy Tony Blair's approach and say that they would mimic Labour's spending plans, as Tony Blair had said prior to the 97 election that he would copy Conservative spending plans. But that meant that when the financial crisis came, we weren't able to say this wouldn't happen had we been in charge, because we were stuck with Labour's policy. And I agree with your point that post-2010, when we got into government, there was a good deal of austerity, but we could have done more. The nation was ready for it in 2010. It understood why it was so urgent, whereas the nation now does not see the urgency of austerity, which puts pressure on the government to spend more. But I think it must resist this pressure to a good degree. I don't think we can say we will now spend money like there's no tomorrow, because actually we still have a deficit. We still have debt to GDP of over 80%, which is historically our high level. And we still have tax as a percentage of GDP at the levels we haven't really seen since the early 1970s. So there's no room for extra taxation, there's still considerable borrowing, and therefore the government has to be very cautious. But there are within that some public services, particularly the NHS, that are not going to be able to continue with the current restraints.
So within Philip Hammond's kind of world at the moment, he's being pulled arguably in 3 different directions. You have the perhaps traditional pressure to say the Conservatives ought to be a low-taxing party in government and we ought to cut taxes. You have the people, particularly some of your colleagues, who are saying enough's enough, my voters demand, we've got to spend more money on X, Y and Z to demonstrate it's been worth it. And in the middle, is it just that the average position of those 2 extremes is hold the course, or is there actually a caucus in the Conservative Party or on the Conservative benches saying stick with it? Is there proper support for him among MPs, or have they simply lost their appetite for sticking with this?
I think there's proper support for continuing to be sensible. That the Conservatives stay in office when the electorate thinks that the Conservatives are good at running the economy. And against Jeremy Corbyn, we're in a pretty strong position to show that we know what we're doing. If we were to ape Corbyn-esque policies, it's hardly likely that that would be electorally successful. And I think the electorate is highly sensitive to these arguments. I think it understands these arguments and realises that governments can't just splash out money that the government hasn't got.
So in terms of perhaps the 2 areas that I think we've talked about before, indeed on the Moggcast, the NHS, as you say, it was somewhere where there's a case perhaps for some more spending in some ways, and also the case where there's a big growth in demand, particularly recently, for more defence spending. Where does the money come from beyond expecting potential uplifts in receipts? Is there anywhere else in the state that could do with less?
Well, I think you point to something that is of great significance, and that is that people who want extra expenditure have to say, where is it coming from? You can't just say, oh, we'd like more money for this and more money for that and more money for the next thing, and we'd like some tax cuts as well. That's not serious economic policy. So what is the answer? Well, The NHS has had £10 billion a year promised to it by the government already. That's already in the government's current spending plans. There comes a £10 billion dividend from leaving the European Union, probably slightly more, but that won't come for a couple of years. That provides the £350 million a week. So we can identify that and we can say, okay, well, let's take that and do what is necessary for the NHS. With defence, I think the obvious thing to do is to raid the overseas aid budget. And the reason for that is that if there is a major crisis somewhere, the body that is called upon to help with it is the Ministry of Defence, that you need the Royal Navy to get the supplies out and to get the helicopters out and so on. And it's really sensible to ensure that money is well spent through defence rather than being siphoned off in DFID. So I think to move a portion of spending to the MOD would still allow us to meet in our own terms, if not on OECD classification terms, the spending commitment that I've never been in favour of, but is part of government policy, and it would help defence as well. So I think you can find those two pools of money. But when you start saying to me, what about further expenditure for social care? I can't raid other budgets again. So then you have to look at structures, and you have to look at whether greater integration of social care and healthcare may provide some of the savings that will release money for social care. And I think they may, because one of the problems with social care is that budgets are fiercely guarded between the NHS and social care, which falls on local authorities.
One reason, as you'll have spotted in advance, I'm sure that I touch on defence, of course, just now, is that since we recorded the last podcast, we've seen the horrendous events in Salisbury, and without there having been a formal statement of responsibility, what we know at minimum is there's been a terrorist attack using some kind of nerve agent on British soil. I think, as the Sun newspaper said last week, it seems unlikely to have been Canada that did it. Certainly this is the latest in a series of events in which people who annoy the Kremlin have a nasty habit of ingesting various toxins, or in some cases bullets, which is very clumsy of them. Where do you think we stand nationally, but also where do you think the government stands on this question of exactly what has happened, exactly what must happen now?
If it is shown, which seems likely, that it was the Russian state that is behind this, either directly from President Putin or by agents of the government state without any direct authorization, then we know that Russia is a rogue state. But actually we know that already, that the invasion of the Crimea was something that states that abide by the international order do not do. Invading sovereign territory is one of the absolutely impossible things for states to do. And what I mean by impossible, I don't mean physically that they can't do it, but in terms of the world legal order, states cannot invade other states' sovereign territory. However much they make a case for it and say they're rescuing native Russians and all of that, it is one of those things that makes you a rogue state if you behave in that way. This just adds to this feeling that Russia is a rogue state. What can the UK do? Well, first of all, we must ensure that our defences are very strong in case of further attacks, particularly rumours of cyber attacks being possible, and we know what happened to Estonia with a cyber attack. Secondly, we need to respond. And what should our response be? Well, we're not going to go to war with Russia. That would be a disproportionate response, and it would be a grave risk to the whole world, because Russia is a nuclear state, so that is not an option. We could expel a few diplomats, but expelling a few diplomats doesn't make any difference to anybody. Russia would laugh at us. So you have to begin to look at what you can do that is an effective response and hits Russia in a way that it will actually mind. And that, I think, ends up having to be financial. And you look at ways in which you can target friends of Putin who have assets in London and go after them aggressively and have a Magnitsky-style law, or move further in that direction so that you can target people close to the Kremlin regime and make their lives more difficult. Whether that is enough, whether that is a strong enough response, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's got to be the starting point.
There's a high degree to which you can look back over, as you said earlier, it's easy to spot mistakes in retrospect, but one also has a responsibility to look at mistakes where they've taken place. Looking back over the general failure to respond to the murder of Litvinenko, a British citizen, on British soil, the invasion of Georgia, which in which the West was found deeply wanting, as you say, the invasion of Crimea and the ongoing war in Ukraine. That's a period of emboldening for Putin, which has spanned Labour government, coalition, Conservative government. Is there a reason why Britain simply seems ill-equipped to face this? Is this a question of lack of political culture? Is it a question of lack of demand and understanding among the electorate? Or is it something else?
And you've missed out Syria. And the difficulty with Syria is that Putin realised that ISIS was a greater threat than Assad, and we thought that Assad was a greater threat than ISIS, effectively, and therefore were helping so-called moderates, who then turned out to be moderately supportive of ISIS. So in Syria, our policy was ineffective, and it allowed Putin to take a position of effectively global leadership. And so, yes, I accept your point that we have made a lot of errors. It's always difficult to get a proportionate response, and this has been an issue that the world has faced in dealing with North Korea as well. How do you deal with rogue states that are willing to behave in a way that is outside normal diplomatic behaviour? And normal diplomatic approaches don't, in fact, work. Do I think the British voter isn't really interested? I think the British voter is always concerned about attacks on the security of the nation. I think the first job of a government is to secure the nation, and that when things like the Salisbury attack takes place, that causes people grave concern. They expect the government to do something. But we should do other things. We should make it absolutely clear to the Baltic states and to Poland that the NATO guarantee is solid, that we will support them. We should perhaps revisit the commitments we made not to have permanent bases in those countries, which we made when the Baltic states left the Soviet Union. We have to think whether that is relevant anymore, and that if Russia is a rogue state, deals you've made with it in the past don't count anymore. And so we have to think about things that Russia might not like and put those into place.
As we saw in terms of the mutual guarantees of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, which were agreed by the UK and Russia, among others, in the 1990s, should we be providing lethal aid to people like the Ukrainian armed forces or the Georgian armed forces?
I think neither Ukraine nor Georgia is a member of NATO, and I think the NATO guarantee is the primary guarantee. So I think we should make it clear that we will protect any NATO country, but I don't think we can extend that guarantee. I also think you get into great trouble, and this is one of the great lessons of history, if you don't make it clear what you're protecting in the first place. If you look at both the First and the Second World War, how do we get dragged into those? We get dragged into those because the aggressor thinks we won't care about the aggression. We haven't made it clear that Poland is absolutely a red line. We haven't made it clear that Belgium is absolutely a red line. So the lesson from that is that we must make it clear that the Baltic states are an absolute red line without any equivocation, and show that we are defending them. I think making somewhere a red line after it's been invaded is a high-risk strategy.
Isn't there some perhaps middle ground between this? If we look at, say, what happened with the Russian invasion of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, for example, Afghanistan was not a NATO state. Certainly the Mujahideen who were fighting the Soviets there were not NATO members, never mind NATO aligned, and yet Britain, America, among others, provided them with military aid on the kind of my enemy's enemy is my friend basis.
Yes, I see the point that you're making. You have to work out who you're dealing with. You have to ask yourself whether our dealings with the Mujahideen in the long run were enormously beneficial to the West, or whether we didn't help create an even greater monster than the Soviet Union, which was anyway declining at that point in terms of its industrial capacity. And so I think you've got to be cautious about this. I think you want to make it clear where your red lines are in future, rather than going back. And state support for freedom fighters, in our view, can become very difficult if the freedom fighters turn out not to be as controllable as you hope, as we found in Syria, where we ended up supporting freedom fighters who turned out to be very close to ISIS.
Or if not that in favour of freedom after all.
Indeed, freedom under their own terms.
There are a couple of awkward questions, I think, domestically when it comes to Russia, which people have raised a fair amount. I'd be interested in your views on. One is the question of the Conservative Party's own relationship with perhaps some people who are, in some cases, semi-detached to the Putin regime. Obviously, we all know that in the last 15, 20 years, there's been quite a large movement of various Russian oligarchs to London in particular. It's become a playground for some people who find the discomforts of actually living under Vladimir Putin's government something they don't want to go through day to day. Did the Conservative Party make a mistake in not being more strict on the kind of donors that it would accept? For example, I'm thinking of things like certain tennis matches.
Well, you have a choice, really. Do you want political parties to be funded by the state, or do you want them to be funded by donors and by trade unions? Personally, I think it's better they should be funded by donors and trade unions rather than by the state. I don't think the taxpayer, the poor, hard-burdened taxpayer, should have to take on further costs that have difficulties with them, because how do you fund third parties, insurgent parties, and so on, and you make it harder for a new party to grow because they won't meet the qualifications to get funding from the state. So I think it ends up being quite undemocratic and quite pro-establishment. I think both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have made a mistake over the decades in that we have attacked trade union funding of the Labour Party and they have attacked corporate funding of the Conservative Party. Corporate funding of the Conservative Party and trade union funding of the Labour Party was probably the most honest way of funding political parties, and you didn't get these conflicts of interest in the same way.
Sure, but is there a difference between, say, an employer in the United Kingdom that manufactures things or offers particular services and so on, giving money to the Conservative Party, and, say, the family members of a former Putin minister giving money to the Conservative Party? Is that a compromising situation?
Well, there are very tight rules about who is allowed to give money. They have to be on the electoral roll, they have to be eligible to vote. Their declaration is, the donation is then declared if it's above £7,500. So there are rules in place to ensure that you know, and then people can draw their own conclusions as to whether policy is being guided by this. As far as I can tell, government policy is not being guided by the donations from the families of Russian oligarchs, and that's very important, that it shouldn't be, and it's where knowledge is, I think, helpful, that it's out in the open.
And the second awkward kind of domestic question, which is something that people ask me as a Leave voter, as a Brexiteer, is where does this all fit with the question of leaving the European Union? Is it not the case that Vladimir Putin would have been pleased to see Britain leave the EU, and is it therefore, by extension, a risk to the West or an indulgence of Russia for us to be doing this?
No, I think the reverse. I think we're much freer in terms of our approach to Russia outside the European Union. Bear in mind, London is the international financial centre, and we can attack Russian interests much more effectively on our own than if we've got to get the Germans to agree. And we have found that we've been pushing for tougher sanctions and that we've been held back. And on the first list of sanctions against individual Russians after the invasion of the Crimea, we had to exclude people on the American list because we were worried it would offend their human rights. Well, I'm not too worried about the human rights of Putin's chums. I think we have to deal pretty robustly, and we'll be freer to do that outside the European Union.
And there are potential signs that the European Union is becoming a bit compromised by this in terms of some of its own members. I mean, even if we look at the most recent election results in Italy, the League, for example, their leader Matteo Salvini has said some extremely positive, praising things about Vladimir Putin, and potentially could end up somewhere near the top table of the EU.
Well, we must be concerned about the relationship with Putin and the relationship people have with him. I think people are allowed to change their mind. And when Putin came in and took over from Yeltsin, it looked as if there was a real chance for Russia to reform and prosper and to get rid of the corruption that there had been under Yeltsin. And in the early years, that looked as if that might be happening. It's now quite clear that that hasn't happened, and Russia is more corrupt than it was and more of a danger to the West. So we'll see whether these politicians who once said nice things about Russia mayn't change their minds in due course. They certainly should.
And on a final, completely different question, I've been struck that while over the years there's been a discomfort in British politics to talk about religion, for example, I know it's something that you've come under some criticism in the past for talking about some of your own religious views. This year we've seen certainly part of the Conservative Parliamentary Party explicitly link things like Lent into policy. So we've seen, I think, some scores of Conservative MPs announce that for Lent they're giving up unrecyclable plastic, for example. Where do you think that's come from, and where do you think it's going to?
It's a very interesting question on the giving up of unrecyclable plastic for Lent. I think this country is still at heart a Christian country, but that we're very British about this. We don't like to wear our heart on our sleeve, and I think that's rather a good thing. I think a quiet underpinning of Christianity is good for our society, but that we don't want to have religious mania.
A still, small voice of calm, as someone might put it.
That is a beautiful way of putting it, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you to all of you at home for listening in. You can, of course, listen and subscribe to the Moggcast on YouTube, iTunes, SoundCloud, and, of course, on conservativehome.com. Thank you very much to Jacob.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
As ever. Goodbye.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.